To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Bolton, and today I'm here with my co-host, Tracy Rosenthal.
Hello.
And we're really excited and honored to be joined by our guest, Bench Ansfield, to talk about their new book. Bench is a historian of racial capitalism, the carceral state, and 20th century U.S. cities. They are an assistant professor of history at Temple University, and their book, which we're talking about today, is called Born in Flames, The Business of Arson and the Remaking of the American City, and it was published by W.W. Norton in August of 2025. Bench, welcome to the Death Panel.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be here. I'm such an admirer of both of you, and I'm really excited to get into it with you.
I'm so excited to have you here today, Bench. I've been eagerly anticipating reading this book for literally years now, and I'm really looking forward to discussing it together. Again, for listeners, the book is called Born in Flames, The Business of Arson and the Remaking of the American City, and it is a history of how vast swaths of housing in the Bronx were systematically burned through the deliberate coordination of landlords, insurers, and the state. It's essentially a political economy of urban arson and the financialization of housing in the late 20th century. Now, the book unearths how during the 1960s and 1970s, racial capitalism reorganized itself around the logics of insurance and financialization. Bench traces how the rhetoric of creative federalism and urban renewal disguised a deeper process of organized abandonment where destruction was not failure, but a kind of function of the market. Through what they call brownlining, the book details how the insurance industry reinvented redlining for a new era, translating anti-Black panic into market rationality and reclassifying entire communities as a kind of combustible asset in the name of risk management. What's so striking about this book, though, is how it reveals that financialization was a moral and epistemic project. In other words, Bench shows that financialization was about reshaping how people understood value, responsibility, and even the truth itself, not just about making new ways to make money. It taught us to see markets as moral forces, to confuse profit with virtue, and to treat exploitation or abandonment as if it was simply the natural order of things. And the insurance industry during this era produced a worldview in which property, safety, and even humanity were distributed according to profitability. And this is a regime that still continues into our current day. The mechanisms of insurance becomes the grammar of neoliberal governance, privatizing protection, pathologizing the dispossessed, and converting a social crisis into an opportunity for speculative gain. And the Bronx ultimately becomes a laboratory for a new urban order whose effects are still everywhere, visible in our day-to-day lives, and visible in our struggles for housing and shelter. Now, it's also worth noting here at the top that Tracy also wrote a brilliant review of Born in Flames for the New Republic, drawing out precisely these stakes, which we'll also link to for y'all in the episode description. But basically, our conversation today will be digging deep into these through lines: the political economy of insurance, the naturalization of pathologization through finance, and the enduring lessons of the tenant movements that fought to reclaim their homes and their futures, that fought against this quote-unquote epidemic of arson. So with all that framing in mind, Bench, could you start by grounding us in the book's argument? What story were you trying to tell about the transformation of the American city, and what do you hope that readers take from seeing the Bronx and the other cities that you talk about in the book as a key to understanding the financial and moral architecture of our present moment?
Yeah, well, first of all, just thank you for that incredible framing. I've done a few of these before, and I've actually never encountered anything so comprehensive and far-reaching. So that was really amazing. So the book, chronicles this wave of landlord arson that blazed through the Bronx, but it wasn't just the Bronx. This was happening in cities all over the country, from Philly to Houston to Los Angeles. And these fires were commonly confused, or are commonly confused in popular memory, with the uprisings of the 1960s. but they weren't for protest. They were lit for profit, most of which benefited the aptly named fire industries, finance, insurance, and real estate. So as you said, the project is framing the arson wave as this sort of window into financialization, right? Which really announces itself in the 1970s, right in the aftermath of the civil rights movement's classical period. So I'm really interested in how the coinciding nature of those two formations, two processes, finance on the one hand and post 1960s racial politics on the other, what that kind of collision can tell us about this critical moment in racial capitalism. And yes, at the center of the book is this state-sponsored fire insurance program. It's called the FAIR Plan. Listeners might have heard about it in the last 9 months in particular, as it's become the principal mechanism for insuring disaster-prone property, especially in California and Florida. It's in the headlines a lot these days. And the FAIR Plan was offered up by the federal government as essentially an anti-redlining measure, right? As a response to the uprisings of the 1960s. But it was actually more of a bailout of the insurance industry. It didn't end discrimination, and it inadvertently incentivized landlords to set their buildings on fire. And though the book does take a national scope, it is definitely rooted in a study of the Bronx, known in these years as the arson capital of the world, and also arguably the anti-arson capital of the world, where these profusion of Black and Latinx anti-arson organizations formed all in the space of the few years, which by the early 1980s really pushed the federal government and pushed the local governments and the insurance industry to stem the tide of the burnings. And then the last thing that I'll mention is that because there's so little governmental response and media coverage of the arson wave for the first at least half of the 1970s, but really until around 1977, I turn an eye to the cultural responses to the fires, right? By considering the kind of omnipresence of the fire trope in the pop culture of the era, from, the Towering Inferno to the Bonfire of the Vanities to basically like every other disco song. Like disco as a genre is kind of like inconceivable without fire in there, as a sort of like hidden transcript for how this was all being understood and interpreted without any sort of official narratives.
Again, I mean, it was just so thrilling to read this, partly because of what we've been describing, just the combination of political economic analysis with, this like studied view of extractive abandonment and the racist logics that are encoded as financial common sense. But I think sometimes, like, before we maybe get into some of those, mechanisms and the turn in capitalism to the fire economy, maybe we could just ground ourselves in some of the human stakes of the arson crisis. Like, I know you share stories in the book about tenants surviving this moment, like sleeping with their shoes on, losing their belongings, losing their lives. And, these fires that affected tens of thousands of apartment buildings across the country in a decade, the human impact of that.
Definitely. I mean, that's really at the foreground of the book, because the toll, the physical, emotional toll of these fires was so large. I mean, there were 30 fires a night in the Bronx. And the fires actually, especially in the Bronx, moved in somewhat predictable patterns, right? Like they actually spread gradually northward from the southernmost reaches of the borough, kind of moving in a building to building in a block to block fashion, which meant that, that movement was discernible to the naked eye, right? Because fires produce smoke, right? It was actually very evident that this was happening, and it was evident where, in what direction they were moving, which meant that you could see them coming towards your neighborhood, sometimes years ahead of time, which meant that tenants had to cultivate this kind of impossible vigilance, this like, I call it a bruising vigilance, in order to stay alive, right? And that meant, yes, like putting your kids to bed with clothes on, with shoes on, keeping a suitcase packed by the door. Like that's what it took actually to survive. And most did survive, which is something. I mean, there were far too many deaths for sure, but considering there were 30 fires a night, the death toll was less than it could have been. And part of that was because landlords were in the habit of tipping tenants off before there was a fire. So they found all different ways to do this, including just like literally sliding a note beneath folks' doors, right? And so, of course, like tenants figured out before anyone that these fires were being lit for profit. And like one of the central dramas of the book is kind of watching tenants try and repeatedly fail to get their policymakers to get, firefighters to take them seriously and believe them that this was indeed a profit-driven arson wave.
Somehow the line from one of the organizers that like the problem would be solved with pencils instead of guns is one of the things that that really has stuck with me and has stuck with me like, after reading the book. It's like that is a solution that I see everywhere, right? Like the poverty in our streets, homelessness, what the state and the right wing and increasingly liberals will offer. They will offer guns as a solution to a problem that actually must be solved with a pencil. And it was just such a insight really, emerging from the experience of tenants and from the, movement of organizers. I think that we need to do the work of archiving social movement histories so that we can teach each other how to think about the present. And that is just like one of those things that I'm like going to carry with me for a long time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the person who actually says that is this socialist housing justice organizer who ends up creating like the first early warning system that shows which buildings are more prone to being burned down for profit. He's in Boston, actually. And the federal government is so unprepared for any of this and just constantly behind the landlords in mounting a response that they go all in on like financing this socialist housing group, which is just an interesting thing, thinking in terms of right now. And actually the only tools for stopping this incredible, like epochal process of dispossession in the 1970s was socialist tenant organization, an anarchist tenant organization. Like there were no other tools available. So of course this is why this conflagration came to an end, which is, to the housing crisis today. I mean, we're facing some similar dynamics and kind of only one possible way out.
Well, I think, is kind of core to the book that the history of this arson wave, right, which is like often reduced, as you said, to the story of like urban decay, or it's connected to riots or social collapse, or that it's this kind of aesthetic character of the era, right? What it actually is something so much deeper and a almost like pure political and economic phenomenon. It's a really important point of transformation in the late 20th century of housing. And in the book, you show that, that framing of chaos or pathology is the outcome of a very deliberate realignment of racial capitalism and financialization, where you have both the state and private markets finding new ways to extract value from the process of destruction itself. You talk about in the book this one moment of sort of this development of this industry and the devaluation of certain properties being almost like a actuarial response to the anxiety that social unrest and the Black liberation movement would continue in perpetuity, right? That the kind of like value of property, particularly I'm thinking about like the parts of the book that talk about Philly, the value of property is sort of like couched in this framing of like, well, what if, racial justice uprisings continue, right? Like then, and sort of how can we ensure against the continuation of uprisings, right? And so can you talk a little bit about how that process worked, right? Of the extraction of value from destruction, like how insurance, real estate, and state policy all converged essentially to make abandonment profitable, to naturalize also racial hierarchy as risk management, and to turn entire neighborhoods into essentially laboratories for a kind of new urban order that's built on disinvestment, speculation around disinvestment, and controlled deliberate decay.
Yeah, such a great question, and kind of in a huge question. I mean, especially, the Bronx is not imagined as the landscape in which you're going to put together a study of financialization. It's not the prototypical site of financialization. Actually, it's like kind of the inverse site in like the popular imagination of what financialization was and what it is and what it looks like. Like that contrast, that friction between the Bronx in particular and the financial world is so intense that that's actually what drives the plot of Bonfire of the Vanities, which is one of the top 10 best-selling books of the 1980s. When I ask students to close their eyes and picture what finance looked like in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, they inevitably say, something, even if they don't know the names, they'll say something along the lines of Gordon Gekko or Patrick Bateman, or some other kind of, Wall Street suit in a corner office. And those stories are important and evidently profitable to tell. But the triumph of financialization, the triumph of the FIRE industries wasn't just this process that plays out on trading floors and in corner offices. It also coursed across the economy, and it touched nearly every aspect of social life as it did so. And yet we weirdly know very little relatively about these material effects of finance than we do about literally the drug habits of the guys who are playing on their Bloomberg terminals, right? So I think it's true. And so I think we really need to understand financialization from the ground up, right? And then one of those ways is actually through FIRE itself. I mean, and this is why, I wrote a book about insurance that who the hell, what a terrible idea. Nobody wants to talk about insurance. Nobody wants to think about insurance. It's usually it's associated with very stressful things. It's often very boring. I mean, there's a reason that Luigi Mangione becomes this folk hero. It's something that is only thought about in as much as it's hated on. And yet, I think that the actual physical FIRE is part of what makes insurance into something that people actually want to analyze here. In the 1970s, just as New York is cementing itself the center of the FIRE industries on a global scale, it was crowned the FIRE capital of the world. And the two distinctions were linked, and they were linked because of insurance. The only reason this whole saga was possible was the perverse incentives opened up by this process, right? And the backdrop to that line of inquiry is in kind of what first pulled me into the project in terms of the kind of mystery that I was chasing after was how did the redlining era give way to the age of the subprime loan? This is the question that, as someone who graduated college into 2008, this was going to be the kind of question of my life.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.